My landlord gave a stranger a key to my apartment and put a mattress in my living room without telling me. I filed one complaint and he lost everything. I signed a 12-month lease on a one-bedroom in March. One tenant, one bedroom, one name on the agreement. Mine. The rent was $900 a month, which I could manage between my print shop job and weekend shifts at the car wash. The building had 6 units and was owned by a man named Gus Keever. Gus inherited 2 buildings from his father and lived off the rent. He wasn't a big-time landlord. He was just a guy who treated the properties like personal piggy banks. The first 3 months were quiet. Then in June, I came home on a Wednesday and there was a mattress in my living room, not a couch. A full-sized mattress with a fitted sheet and a pillow sitting in the middle of my floor. A duffel bag beside it, a pair of boots by my front door that were not mine. I stood in my own apartment looking at a stranger's bed and a stranger's shoes, and I didn't understand what I was seeing. I called Gus. He told me he had a guy named Ronnie who needed a place to stay, and that since my living room had the space, he figured it would be fine. He said Ronnie was going to pay him $300 a month directly, and it wouldn't affect my rent at all. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I told him my lease said one tenant. He told me to read the building policy addendum. I pulled up the lease on my phone and read every word. There was no addendum. There was no temporary occupant clause. He told me it was posted in the laundry room. I went down to the laundry room. There was nothing on any wall. I went back upstairs, and Ronnie was in my apartment sitting on the mattress eating a sandwich. He looked up and said Gus told him I was cool with it. I told him I was not. He said Gus had given him a key that morning and told him to set up in the living room. Gus gave a stranger a key to my apartment without telling me. I asked Ronnie to leave. He said he understood, but he'd already paid Gus the $300 and had nowhere else to go. Ronnie called Gus while I stood there. I could hear Gus through the phone telling Ronnie to stay, telling him I'd get used to it. Ronnie hung up and looked at me like he didn't know what to do. I told him he had until morning. He left that night and took his mattress and his bag and his boots with him. He said on his way out that Gus had made it sound like a normal arrangement. I told him it wasn't his fault. The next day, I went to the tenant rights office at the county courthouse. I spoke with a woman named Odessa. I showed her my lease. I told her about the key and the mattress and the phone call. She read the lease twice and told me Gus had violated 3 separate tenant protection statutes: entering a unit without proper notice, giving a third party a key without written consent, attempting to place an unauthorized occupant. She asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I told her yes. The housing authority opened an investigation within 2 weeks. They sent an inspector. He didn't just look at my unit. He looked at all 6. What he found was worse than what had happened to me. The tenant in Unit 1 said Gus had been storing personal furniture in her spare closet and told her it was part of her agreement. The tenant in Unit 4 said Gus had been using her balcony to smoke on weekends through a shared hallway door. Neither had complained because they didn't know they could. The inspector also found a broken fire escape latch on the 2nd floor, faulty wiring in the basement, and a water heater that hadn't been serviced in over 4 years. Any one of those things could have hurt someone. The violations triggered a compliance order on the entire building. Gus was given 60 days to fix everything or face daily fines. Odessa told me the order would be posted in the lobby so every tenant could see it. She said landlords like Gus counted on tenants not knowing what they could do. She said most people never reported anything because they assumed nothing would happen if they did. Gus called me 2 days after the order was posted. The second I heard his voice, I knew he wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling to save himself. All I had done was file one complaint about one mattress in one living room. Everything else was his own mess catching up with him. Buckle up, because Gus was about to show me exactly who he was. He opened with a tone I didn't expect. He wasn't yelling. He sounded calm, friendly, like a guy calling to check in on a neighbor. He said he'd been thinking about it and he shouldn't have put Ronnie in there without asking, and that was on him. It threw me off. I'd been bracing for a fight. He kept going before I could respond. He said he'd already hired a contractor for the fire escape and the wiring. He made it sound like he was ahead of the order and just needed the system to catch up with him. Then he made his real move. He said if I called Odessa and told her things had been resolved between us, he'd drop my rent to $700 a month for the rest of the lease. $200 less a month. For a woman working full-time at a print shop and picking up weekend shifts at a car wash, $200 was groceries, gas, one less Saturday shift. Gus knew exactly what number to pick. I told him I needed to think about it. He said, take my time. I hung up and called Princess. Princess was an older woman from the car wash who had worked in property management for years before she retired. She'd seen every trick in the book. I told her everything. The call, the tone, the offer. She listened without interrupting, and then she said he wasn't offering me a discount. He was buying my silence. If I dropped the complaint, the investigation would stop. The other tenants would lose their case. And next year he'd do the same thing to someone else. She said if Gus was actually sorry, he wouldn't need me to call Odessa. He'd just fix the problems and let the inspection happen. The only reason he wanted that call was because he was scared of what they'd find next. She said his offer was proof he was scared, not sorry. A man who is actually sorry doesn't put conditions on his apology. That's not remorse. That's a deal. I sat at my kitchen table after she hung up and I felt embarrassed. I'd been one phone call away from letting him off the hook over $1,200. I opened my texts and typed one line to Gus. I'm not dropping the complaint. I hit send. He didn't respond. No call, no text, nothing, just silence. And the silence hit harder than anything he could have said. After I sent that text, I started paying closer attention to the building. I expected Gus to blow up. Instead, the attack came sideways. It started small. The tenant from Unit 1 used to nod at me on the stairs. A few days after my text, she walked right past me staring at the wall. The tenant from Unit 4 used to say good morning every day without fail. That week, she moved past me like I was invisible. By the end of the week, nobody in the building would look at me. If I walked into the laundry room, someone would grab their clothes and leave. If I was at the mailboxes, whoever came in behind me would wait until I left. I felt like I had some kind of disease that everyone could see but me. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. People don't all go cold on you you at the same time for no reason. Someone had gotten to them. I waited until I saw the tenant from Unit 1 head downstairs with her laundry. I followed her down. She was loading the machine when I walked in. Her whole body went stiff. She kept her eyes on the machine like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I walked up and asked her what was going on. She kept putting clothes in slowly, like she was hoping I'd give up and leave. I didn't move. Finally, she let out a long breath and said Gus had told them the fines were coming out of their security deposits if he couldn't cover them. He said it was because of my complaint. I felt the floor drop out from under me. He had gone door to door telling every tenant my complaint was about to cost them money. That was why they wouldn't look at me. They thought I was the reason they were about to lose hundreds of dollars. I told her that wasn't how it worked. A landlord couldn't use deposits to pay code violations. She just shrugged and said she didn't know the law. She just knew she couldn't afford to lose that money. I went back to my apartment and grabbed my jacket. I drove to the courthouse and told Odessa what Gus had been telling the other tenants. Her expression got hard, not at me, at what she was hearing. She said it was a separate violation, tenant intimidation, lying about their legal rights to pressure them into turning against someone who filed a lawful complaint. She walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out the section of the tenant protection statute that covered security deposits, highlighted the key lines, and handed me the pages. She said I didn't need to be a lawyer. I just needed to show them what the law said. I drove home with those copies on the passenger seat. I went door to door in my own building. When someone opened up, I handed them a page and told them Gus had lied. He couldn't touch their deposits. He told them that to make them turn on me. Some read it right there in the doorway. Some took it inside and came back a few minutes later with questions. The tenant from Unit 4 was the one who hit me the hardest. She read the highlighted section slowly, moving her finger along the lines. Then she looked up and her eyes were wet. She said Gus had told her she'd be evicted if she didn't keep quiet. I told her that was retaliation. That was illegal too. She said she'd been so scared she'd almost started packing. By the end of that night, 2 tenants told me they wanted to file their own complaints. Unit 4 was one of them. The other was a man on the second floor with his own list of things Gus had done that he never reported because he didn't think anybody would care. I gave them Odessa's name and the address of the office. Gus thought he was dealing with one angry tenant. He was about to find out he was dealing with a building full of them. 3 days later, I was in my kitchen making coffee before my evening shift when someone pounded on my door. Not knocked, pounded. The kind of knock that shakes the door in its frame. I looked through the peephole. Gus was standing in the hallway. Beside him, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else, was Ronnie. I hadn't seen Ronnie since the night he carried his mattress out of my living room. I opened the door. Gus didn't let me speak. He put his hand on Ronnie's back and pushed him forward like he was presenting evidence. He said, tell her what you told me. Ronnie wouldn't look at me. His hands were in his jacket pockets and his shoulders were up by his ears like he was trying to make himself smaller. He said he'd told Gus he'd be willing to tell the housing authority it was a misunderstanding, that he was just visiting, not a permanent thing. I could see on his face he didn't want to be there. Gus had brought him here like a prop, the same way he'd used the mattress, the same way he'd used the other tenants. I looked at Ronnie and I spoke like Gus wasn't standing there. I said he'd told me himself that Gus gave him a key and told him to set up in my living room. He'd paid Gus $300. Ronnie shifted his weight. He said he knew, but Gus had told him if the building got shut down, a lot of people would lose their homes. He said Ronnie could help fix it. The same playbook. Guilt, pressure, lies. He'd taken a guy who already felt bad about what had happened and twisted that guilt into a weapon he could aim at me. I kept my eyes on Ronnie. I said lying to the housing authority was fraud. If they found out he gave a false statement, he was the one in trouble, not Gus. Ronnie's eyes went wide. His whole face changed. He clearly hadn't thought about that part. Gus hadn't told him, because Gus didn't care what happened to Ronnie. Ronnie was $300 a month to him. That was all he'd ever been. Gus jumped in fast. He said nobody was going to find out anything. Just tell them it was a visit. He said it the way you'd tell a kid to stop worrying, like committing fraud was the same as rounding up on a timesheet. But Ronnie wasn't buying it anymore. I could see the change happen in the hallway. Whatever guilt trip Gus had used to get him there, it broke. Ronnie took a step back from Gus. A real, physical step. He said he wasn't doing it. He wasn't lying to the government. Gus's face went red, not pink. Red. The calm landlord voice disappeared in 2 seconds. He turned to me and his voice came out low and hard. He said I was going to regret making this into a war. He said he'd make sure I didn't get a lease renewal. He said I'd be out in 5 months and good luck finding something I could afford. I didn't move. I didn't step back. I didn't look away. I let every word land and then I let the silence sit. Then I said everything he just said was retaliation against a tenant who filed a lawful complaint. And Ronnie had heard every word. Gus's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He turned and stormed down the hallway. His footsteps pounded down the stairs hard enough to echo through the floor. Ronnie was still at my door rubbing the back of his neck. He said he was sorry Gus had dragged him into it again. I told him he'd done the right thing. He nodded and walked toward the stairs quieter than Gus had. I closed my door and sat at my kitchen table and grabbed a notebook. Princess had told me weeks ago that when you're dealing with someone like Gus, your memory is your friend, but paper is your proof. She'd said always write it down while it's fresh because details fade and people like Gus will try to say it never happened. I wrote down every word Gus said. The threat about the renewal, the line about me not affording anything else, the way he pushed Ronnie forward, the date, the time, that Ronnie was present. I texted Odessa. I told her Gus had come to my door and tried to coach Ronnie into giving a false statement. I told her about the renewal threat. I told her Ronnie was a witness. An hour later, her response came through. Document everything. Bring it to her office. 4 days later, I came home from work and found a notice taped to my door. A letter on what looked like official building letterhead. It said my lease would not be renewed due to repeated disturbances and uncooperative behavior. The effective move-out date was the last day of my current lease. The language was formal, but the letter had no legal backing. No attorney's name, no management company logo, just Gus's signature at the bottom like that was supposed to make it official. Repeated disturbances, uncooperative behavior. Those were his words for what I'd done. Filing a legal complaint and telling my neighbors the truth. I peeled the letter off my door and read it 3 times standing in the hallway. I folded it carefully and put it in my bag. I treated it like what it was, which was a gift. Because Gus, in all his panic, had done the one thing you should never do when you're already under investigation. He'd put his threats on paper, he'd signed his name, and he'd taped them to the door of the tenant who started the whole thing. I drove to the courthouse in the morning and handed the letter to Odessa without saying a word. She read it twice and shook her head. She said this was textbook retaliation. He'd actually put it in writing. She said most landlords were at least smart enough to make threats verbally where there's no record. Gus had written it on letterhead, dated it, signed it, and delivered it himself. He'd basically written a confession. She said the housing authority was preparing a formal ruling on the building, and everything was going in as one package. The inspection violations, the deposit threats, the retaliation letter. Then she said something that made me sit up straight. She said at this point they weren't just talking about fines. They were talking about possible license revocation for both properties. Both. Gus had a second building across town. I didn't know who lived there, but Odessa said if the authority found a pattern of misconduct, they could open up his entire portfolio. One complaint about one mattress in one living room, and the whole thing was spreading like a crack in a window. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. The voice on the other end asked if I was the tenant who'd filed the complaint against Gus Keever. He said his name was Riker. He lived in Gus's other building. He'd heard about the investigation from someone in my building. He said he'd been dealing with the same kind of thing. Gus had let himself into his apartment twice the year before to show it to someone while he was at work. Didn't ask, didn't notify, just walked in with another man and showed the place around like Riker didn't live there. He said he'd never reported it because he didn't think anything would happen. I told him everything. Odessa, the office, how to file, what to bring. He was quiet for a second, and then he said he was going tomorrow. I sat at my kitchen table after he hung up. Another tenant, another building, another set of violations. I hadn't gone looking for him. I hadn't organized anything. All I had done was file one complaint back in June. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10. I got to the courthouse at 9:15. The hearing room was small, a conference room with a long table at the front, and rows of chairs facing it like a classroom. Fluorescent lights that made everything look a little too bright and a little too real. Odessa was already there organizing files into stacks with sticky tabs. Riker walked in a few minutes later. He was a tall guy, quiet. He sat down next to me and just said he'd filed and everything was in there. The tenant from Unit 4 came in after him. She looked different, standing up straighter, eyes clear. She wasn't the woman who'd told me she almost started packing. She sat down on my other side and squeezed my arm once without saying anything. The tenant from Unit 1 came in and sat a row behind us, quiet, but there. At 5 minutes to 10, Gus walked in alone. No lawyer, no friend, nobody. He was wearing a button-down that looked like he'd ironed it that morning, but his eyes were red and his skin looked gray. He stood in the doorway and scanned the room. His eyes moved across the chairs. He saw Riker. He saw Unit 4. He saw Unit 1. Then he saw me. He didn't say a word. He walked to the back row and sat down as far from us as he could without leaving the room. He crossed his arms over his chest and stared at the wall. The hearing officer came in at 10. A woman in a dark blazer with reading glasses on a chain. She opened a thick folder and didn't waste any time. She said she was going to begin by reading the list of formal complaints and documented violations filed against Gus Keever as the registered owner of both properties. She didn't stop for almost 5 minutes. Unauthorized entry into an occupied unit. Unauthorized occupant placement. Key distribution to a third party without tenant consent. Failure to maintain fire safety equipment. Faulty electrical wiring. Neglected water heater maintenance. Misrepresentation of building policy. Threats to tenant security deposits as intimidation. Written lease retaliation against a tenant who filed a lawful complaint. Unauthorized unit access at the second property on 2 separate occasions. Each one landed in the room like a rock in still water. When she finished, she asked Gus if he wanted to make a statement. He stood up and tried to look reasonable. He said this was being blown out of proportion. He said he'd managed these buildings for over a decade without a single complaint. The hearing officer looked at him over her glasses. She said the absence of prior complaints didn't indicate the absence of violations. It indicated tenants who didn't know their rights. He tried again. He said he'd already started repairs. The contractor could vouch for him. She asked for documentation, receipts, permits, inspection reports. He opened his mouth and closed it. He sat back down. She called my name. I stood and walked to the front and opened the notebook I'd been keeping since June. Every date, every conversation, every detail written down in ink the way Princess had taught me. I went through the mattress, the key, the phone calls, the $700 offer, the night Gus showed up at my door with Ronnie, the retaliation letter. I read the exact words from the letter from my notes. I spoke calmly and didn't rush. I sat down. Unit 4 was called next. Her voice shook at first and got stronger. She told them about the balcony. She told them about the eviction threat. She told them about the deposit lie. Her voice cracked when she said that part. She said she'd almost packed her things because she thought she was going to lose her home for not keeping her mouth shut. The room was dead quiet when she finished. Riker was called up. He told them about Gus walking into his apartment twice without notice. The signs someone had been inside. The neighbor who saw Gus showing it around like the place was empty. Gus tried to interrupt. The hearing officer pointed at his chair and told him to sit down. He sat. By the time Riker finished, Gus had lost the color in his face. The officer reviewed Odessa's files, the inspection report, the retaliation letter, the notes from every complaint. Then she folded her hands and delivered the ruling. The housing authority was revoking Gus Keever's rental license for both properties. He was fined for every documented violation on record. He was ordered to return all tenant security deposits in full within 30 days. He was barred from collecting rent on either building until every code violation was repaired and passed re-inspection. She looked directly at him and told him he'd treated these properties as personal assets, with no regard for the legal rights of the people living in them. That ended today. Gus stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't speak. He pushed his chair back and walked out of the room. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Riker. He didn't look at any of them. My lease ended in February. I moved across town. The building sold in April. I never heard from Gus again.